Hi guys, this week we're concentrating on what you chew, and the component of the success path that we are focusing on improving is taking control of your environment, which essentially means not having immediate access to highly processed foods within the space in which you live and or most typically spend your time. This could include your home, your workspace, your car, or anywhere else. The premise being that if we do not have immediate access to these foods, then we are less likely to eat them. Hence the saying, out of sight equals out of mind. Because from a food behavioral perspective, this is the single most powerful strategy available to us when it comes to minimizing our consumption of highly processed foods. And that's because when highly processed foods are in our environment, then it's very difficult to say no to eating them, especially if we are stressed out, tired, time poor, unorganized, or simply don't enjoy cooking. Much in the same way as it wouldn't be wise for an alcoholic to have immediate access to alcohol in their environment. So the same goes for highly processed foods too, if we are someone who is susceptible to consuming them. And the reality is that many of us do consume too many highly processed foods. In fact, did you know that highly processed foods make up close to 80% of the typical American diet, with other westernized nations like the UK and Australia trailing not too far behind. In fact, the consumption of highly processed foods has become so common that even a whole food diet has become nothing more than just another fad or trend, which is really quite sad. It's a far cry from when I grew up, where apart from lollies here and there, the only time I really ate highly processed foods was at school on lunch or a day once a month. I remember I'd either get a sausage roll or some steamed dim sims, and even that was seen as a treat. And the reason why I ate so little highly processed foods is because my parents, like many others, cooked all of their meals from scratch, meaning whole foods, which is something many of us don't seem to do anywhere near as often as today. Instead today, convenience is king, and as such, we have moved more to relying on quickly prepared or ready to eat highly processed foods more so than ever before. So, what are highly processed foods? Well, it's important to understand that nearly all foods are processed, at least to some extent anyway. And just because they are, then that doesn't mean that they are not healthy. For example, dried beans are often processed to make them shelf stable, but this has no effect on their nutritional content. However, with that said, it is true that the more a food is processed, the less healthy it becomes. And to better understand this, we can look at the Brazilian food classification system called NOVA, which explains that foods are separated into 4 categories based upon the extent of processing they go through. And this is how it works. I've just drawn it out on a board to save a little bit of time. Okay, so we have our 4 categories of processed foods here. Okay, so our food groups. Group 1. Okay, so Group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And this includes things such as fresh, dry, frozen vegetables or fruit, grains, legumes, meat, fish, eggs, nuts, and seeds. And an explanation for Group 1 would be processing includes removal of inedible or unwanted parts, does not add substances to the original food. In other words, whole foods direct from nature itself. And plenty of examples here, okay? The second group when we're talking about processed foods is processed culinary ingredients. This includes things like plant oils such as coconut oil and olive oil, animal fats such as cream, butter and lard, maple syrup, sugar, honey and salt. Okay, and an explanation for group 2 would be substances derived from group 1 foods, okay, or from nature by processes including pressing, refining, grinding, milling and drying. Okay, so that's group 2. Group 3 is processed foods. Okay, so actually processed foods. And this includes things like canned or pickled vegetables, meat, fish or fruit, artisanal breads, cheeses, salted meats. Alcohol includes all things like beer, wine, cider and spirits. And an explanation for group 3 would be processing of foods from groups 1 or 2 with the addition of oil, salt and or sugar by means of canning, pickling, smoking, curing or fermentation. And the final group we have is group 4. And this is highly processed foods. Okay, and there's some examples of this include sugar sweetened beverages, sweet and savory packaged snacks, reconstituted meat products, pre-prepared frozen dishes, canned or instant soups, things like chicken nuggets and ice creams. Okay, so an explanation for group 4 highly processed foods would be formulations made from a series of processes including extraction and chemical modification. Includes very little intact group 1 foods. So includes very little whole foods. You won't find much of this, what's here, left in the end product here. Okay, so these are foods so far removed from their natural state that they have very little, if any, of their original nutrition left. So now that you know what the different categories of processed foods are, I want to talk about why processed foods, and in particular, highly processed foods, are so bad for you. Okay. Something I prepared earlier. And the first reason is because highly processed foods are lower in vitamins and minerals. It's simple, really. The more human interference or the more foods are processed, the more nutrition they lose. This is why many foods today are fortified with fiber, vitamins and minerals. However, these are never often as good as those contained in unprocessed foods. So if you're someone who eats a lot of processed foods, then it's very likely that you are not getting enough vitamins and minerals and even phytochemicals. Among other things, this results in a decreased level of good bacteria and an increased level of bad bacteria, which can lead to inflammation and harm your gut microbiome. Next, processed foods contain a lot of refined carbohydrates, okay? And whilst carbs are not evil, it depends upon how much you eat, what you eat it with, and most importantly, what is the source of the carbs. Carbs that come from actual whole foods that haven't been changed are actually fine. It's the refined carbs that are a problem. Most notably, refined carbs play havoc with your hormones and cause blood sugar spikes, which result in a drop and increased hunger again. And this is why many people who eat a lot of processed foods are constantly snacking, constantly hungry and never satisfied, because there is not enough fiber as well, okay? Which takes me on to the next point, and that is decreased fiber. A lot of processing removes the fiber from the original food. And so if you're someone who eats a lot of processed foods, then it's very likely that you are not getting enough fiber. Remember that you need enough fiber for good digestive health, to prevent constipation and to help you feel fuller for longer. In fact, people who eat more fiber tend to weigh less because they get satisfied with a smaller amount of food. Next, highly processed foods contain more bad fats. Hydrogelation is a process where manufacturers add hydrogen to a liquid fat, such as a vegetable oil, to turn into a solid fat at room temperature. The result is trans fats, and these are the worst fats for you, and they increase inflammation within the body, which is the root cause of all disease. I can't stress that enough. Food manufacturers add hydrogenated oils to foods for several reasons, including cutting costs, preserving foods, enhancing texture and enhancing taste, which is why it can be found in the majority of highly processed foods today. Next, highly processed foods contain lots of sodium. Okay, so sodium occurs naturally in fruits and vegetables and is essential for bodily functions by maintaining the right balance of fluids, helping to transmit nerve impulses, and by influencing muscle performance. However, consuming too much sodium causes the body to retain fluids, disrupting bodily functions and stressing the heart and kidneys and raising your blood pressure. Most highly processed foods contain way too much sodium, with many restaurant meals no better. The next reason why highly processed foods are bad for you is because they often contain a lot of added sugar, added sugar. Whether it's for the taste, the texture, or to improve shelf life, sugar is added to most processed foods. The World Health Organization suggests no more than 25 grams of sugar per day. But many of us who eat lots of highly processed foods are eating over 100 grams of sugar per day. And so if you reduce the amount of highly processed foods in your diet, then you also significantly reduce your sugar intake, as whole foods don't have much sugar. Next is that eating too many highly processed foods can make it harder to enjoy whole foods. Now, most processed foods are engineered to taste irresistible and to be extremely tempting. And food engineers do this by designing foods in a way which stimulate our brain's feel-good dopamine center, so that you literally cannot stop eating and crave more of them in the future. Take a packet of chips or chocolate as a primary example. You're thinking it's going to have one piece or a few chips, and you end up having a whole pack. And that's because they are engineered to taste that good. And so what happens is, over time, is that your taste buds get so accustomed to that punch of artificial flavor that nature's whole foods kind of taste bland. And especially so if you're eating processed foods which contain lots of added sugars. This stops you from enjoying things like grapes or an apple, just because you don't have the same hit, and therefore it's just not as enjoyable. And this makes it much harder to break free from the processed food space and transition to a healthier diet. Next, eating processed foods often results in more calories. Also, following on from the last point, because it's easy to overindulge in highly processed foods. In doing so, we often consume way too many calories, and more than we should, and more than we realize. For example, four small squares of that chocolate I just showed you contains about 100 calories, while an entire medium zucchini is only about 17 calories. Another reason why this is the case is because highly processed foods are often softer and therefore easier to chew and swallow, meaning you can often eat them much faster than non-processed foods, which doesn't give your body enough time to signal to you that it has had enough calories before it's too late. Not only that, but highly processed foods are easier to digest than unprocessed whole foods, which means that our bodies burn less energy when digesting them. In fact, it's estimated we burn half as many calories digesting processed foods compared to unprocessed foods. This fact, combined with the calorie density of processed foods in general, can make it easy to pack on the pounds. Next is the fact that highly processed foods are often full of artificial ingredients. In fact, there are about 5,000 substances that can get added to highly processed foods. And most of them have never been tested by anyone other than the manufacturers using them. Substances include additives to change color, texture, flavor, and odor, as well as ingredients like preservatives and sweeteners. Obviously, many of these ingredients affect people differently. Take monosodium glutamate, otherwise commonly referred to as MSG, as an example. Some people can tolerate it with minimal issues, whilst others cannot. And it's the same thing when it comes to gums, such as xanthan gum. If you have a very strong digestive system, you can handle them, but many people with a weaker digestion cannot. And so we don't want to be consuming these artificially made substances, as we really don't understand the long-term impacts of doing so. And so when we look at the effects that processed foods and everything that they represent, low in vitamins and minerals, lots of refined carbs, low fiber, increased bad fats, increased sodium, added sugar, harder to enjoy whole foods, calories, artificial, ingredients, then what we get is a whole host of health implications, okay? That's what we get. I've already written it here. Such as an increased risk of developing cancer. In fact, for every 10% of increased consumption of highly processed foods, you increase your risk of developing cancer by 12%. Okay, so considering that 80% of some people's diets are made up of highly processed foods, this equates to a 96% extra chance of developing cancer. Crazy stuff. Next, we have obesity, which according to the World Health Organization is the world's biggest health problem, mainly because it is a precursor for almost every other health problem, including all the ones mentioned here. And I've already previously outlined how processed foods can easily lead to excess weight gain, not only by affecting our metabolism, but also by changing our behaviors around food. In other words, unless you stop eating highly processed foods, then it is almost impossible to lose any excess weight. Next, we have heart disease, which is our nation's biggest killer. Highly processed foods can cause high blood pressure and high cholesterol, which can lead to premature aging and death of your heart. It's as simple as that. Also, diabetes is an ever-growing problem, and the biggest culprit is processed foods, especially all of the sugar contained in them. And then we have the effects on things like our mental health. Processed foods can lead to inflammation throughout the body and brain, which can contribute to mood disorders, including things like anxiety and depression. The problem is that when most of us feel stressed, anxious, or depressed, it's often processed foods we reach for in search of a quick pick-me-up, which can be a vicious cycle and one which is tricky to break if we're addicted to processed foods, as many of us are. And so at the end of the day, it's easy to see why consuming too many highly processed foods are responsible for more deaths than drugs, smoking, and alcohol combined. And you can probably also understand why I'm so adamant that you eliminate most highly processed foods from your environment. Just remember, what you have in your environment is what you'll eat, and what you eat is what you'll be, and how you'll feel. Well, and so whilst our genes might load the gun, it's our environment that pulls the trigger. At the same time, as we have seen in this lesson, remember that not all processed foods are unhealthy, and it's not realistic to cut out all processed foods. Instead, we need to eliminate our consumption of highly processed foods as much as possible if we want to not only get into our best shape, but also have good general health too. The biggest thing is that when you eat a lot of processed foods, then you're crowding out a lot of the whole foods that could have been part of your diet, including missing out on all of the good nutrition, you know, all those vitamins and minerals that we spoke about. Basically, all of those good things to keep you healthy. Okay, so now that you know why it's so important to eat less highly processed foods, now I'm going to show you exactly how to start doing so. And the first and most important thing that you want to do is to remove any highly processed foods from your environment. Now, it doesn't matter what area of your environment that you start with. You know, it could be your pantry, could be your fridge, could be your freezer or anywhere else. What you want to do is to go through each of these areas and get rid of any highly processed foods. Now, if you're someone who eats a lot of highly processed foods, then I'd suggest that you don't do every area at the same time, as you don't want to be left without any food before you are able to next go shopping again. Instead, just focus on cleaning out one area at a time before moving on to the next area. And just remember that the goal is to remove highly processed foods and replace them with whole or minimally processed foods. For example, when it comes to your pantry, you want to remove items such as white bread, including white breadcrumbs, white pasta, things like boxed macaroni and cheese, canned soups, flavored rices, instant noodles, instant mashed potatoes, things like beef jerky and spam and corned beef or other canned meats. Also sweetened breakfast cereals such as Cocoa Pops and Fruit Loops and cereal bars. Also instant oatmeal packets as well. Also ready to bake pie crust and pastry, Belgian waffles, crumpets, croissants, bagels, pastries, boxed cake mixes, boxed pancake mixes, anything boxed, biscuits, cookies, wafers, muffins, donuts, ready-made icing, jelly, roll-ups, you know, things like flavored granola and muesli with added sugar and preservatives, heavily processed protein bars and also protein powders, but just remember that some of these are okay. Many dried fruit snacks, things like glazed cherries, canned fruits in syrup, so anything in syrup, sugar-free jams, chocolate spreads, white sugar, artificial maple syrup, artificial sweeteners like Splenda, white and milk chocolate, including chocolate bars, sprinkles, lollies, chips, including things like Doritos and Cheetos, also microwavable popcorn, most crackers, things like soybean, corn, canola, sunflower and safflower oils, regular tomato and barbecue sauces, salsa dips, meal replacement shakes, anything with the word diet in it basically. Also coffee creamers and instant cappuccino mixes and excess amounts of alcohol, including beer, wine, cider and spirits. Then, once you have removed these items from your pantry, you want to make sure that you either throw them out or give them away to charity if that makes it easier to let go of them. And then you want to go about restocking your pantry with fresh produce. And this includes fresh seasonal fruit and vegetables, and organic where possible. It's also a good idea to ensure that you always have freshly chopped produce on the kitchen bench, because if it's there, you're going to eat it. Also, when it comes to canned and bottled goods, you want to stock up on things such as canned tomatoes, tomato paste, you know, canned beans such as batoli beans or chickpeas, black beans, red beans, kidney beans, so many different kinds of beans. They're great. Things like coconut milk, canned fish such as tuna, mackerel, sardines, and salmon. Also, when it comes to grains and legumes, you want to stock up on things like whole wheat or all-purpose, flours, assorted wheat pastas, brown rice, whole wheat breadcrumbs, whole wheat panko crumbs, things like pearl barley. Okay, so pearl barley is really good. Whole wheat couscous and bulgur and dried lentils. We eat a lot of lentils, dried beans and polenta. You also want to ensure that you have lots of nuts and seeds, okay? Lots of nuts and seeds, and such as, walnuts, pecans, almonds, peanuts, and natural peanut butter, hazelnuts, pine nuts, sesame seeds, tahini, natural almond butters, assorted dry fruits such as apricots, prunes, cherries, cranberries, dates, figs, sultanas, and raisins, which can be used in so many recipes. Then you have all of your oils and vinegars and condiments, which includes ensuring that your pantry is stocked up with things like extra virgin olive oil and coconut oil, unsalted butter and whole egg mayonnaise and white, red wine, white wine and cider vinegars, sriracha, Dijon mustard, ketchup, olives, balsamic and rice wine vinegars. Seasonings are also really important too, and you should keep your pantry stocked up with things like good quality salt, black peppercorns, onions, fresh garlic, dried herbs such as bay leaves and dried thyme leaves and dried oregano. Spices such as chili powder and cinnamon and cumin and curry powder and paprika and cayenne pepper and crushed red peppers, turmeric, garlic powder. You can make so many different things with all these spices. Also citrus such as lemons and limes and oranges. Also other things like brown sugar and pure maple syrup. Okay, cacao powder. Next, when it comes to your refrigerator, you want to get rid of things such as ready-made meals, such as pastas and pizzas. Also, most processed dips, sausages, hot dogs, deli meats such as stras, chicken loaf, salami, pepperoni, and cabana, and rotisserie chicken. Also, processed cheeses like individual cheese slices and sticks. Most fruit yogurts, sweetened fruit juice, soft drinks, energy drinks, sport drinks, bottled coffee and iced coffee, bottled water, including water enhancers. Speaking of water, I'm going to grab a drink now. Artificially flavored sparkling water. Things like baked cakes, whipped cream, margarine, and many light butter substitutes and salad dressings. Then, excuse me, once you have removed these items from your fridge, then you want to restock it once again with fresh seasonal fruit and vegetables, okay? As well as other things such as unsweetened coconut milk or oat milk or soy milk or goat milk or cow milk, or, any milk with the least human interference as possible. That's if you like milk. Natural Greek yogurt, things like reduced fat sour cream, ricotta, parmesan cheese, cheddar cheese, eggs, dry white wine for cooking, water-packed tofu, and whole fruit juices such as pomegranate, cranberry, orange, or apple juices. When it comes to your freezer, you want to remove all ready-made purchased frozen meals, meat pies, sausage rolls, corn checks, chico rolls, dim sims, frozen pastas, frozen meat or veggie burgers, chicken nuggets and chicken tenders, frozen pizzas, hash browns, chips and wedges, onion rings, cheese sticks, ready to bake frozen fish products such as fish fillets, fish fingers and fish bites. Also things like frozen desserts including pudding and cheesecakes and fruit pies and strudels and crumbles, as well as ice cream, especially ice confectionery. Then Once you have thrown those out, you want to restock your freezer with frozen vegetables such as, edamame, soybeans, peas and spinach and broccoli and corn and frozen berries and unprocessed fish fillets and meats such as, chicken or beef, things like falafels, whole wheat pizza dough, homemade chicken broth, beef broth and or vegetable broth, healthy breads, frozen yogurt for impromptu desserts, and any healthy meals that you have prepared in advance. Also things like fruit juice concentrates such as orange, apple and pineapple. Obviously you want to do the same thing when it comes to your workplace as well as anywhere else in your environment, which is highly, where highly processed foods may be lurking, including even in your car. And then that's it really. You have taken control of your food environment to ensure that you make healthier food choices once you've done that. With that said, however, if up until now you've been someone who has relied heavily on processed foods, which I mentioned earlier, then you may be feeling a little bit unsure of what recipes you can make out of all of these low processed or whole food ingredients. And if this is the case, then don't fret. It's really just about finding what you want to eat and making it. And I suppose the real key to consistently eating healthy is to prepare whole meals or components of meals ahead of schedule. And this is really, really important because given the busyness of life today, many of us seem to struggle to find a time, let alone the energy, to prepare and eat a healthy meal 3 times a day, every day of the week. However, by preparing meals in advance, then we can avoid this constant struggle and eat healthier meals more consistently, because you won't be scrambling to find something to eat at the last minute and risk being exposed to unhealthy options, such as takeaway or unhealthy TV dinners, because your meal is already prepared and it's healthy. And so if you're not someone who meal preps, then I would strongly encourage you to do so by completing the plan and prepare meals in advance attribute, which can be found in the what you chew component. Look, at the end of the day, if you haven't got highly processed foods in your environment, then you're not going to eat them anywhere near as much as you otherwise would. And that means you'll be eating more real foods, not out of a box, not full of toxic chemicals and additives, just real food as nature intended. Real food that serves your body in ways that processed and prepackaged food cannot. So, does your home environment contain highly processed foods? Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to learn more about the other essential attributes of staying in your best shape. And until next time, watch what you chew, do what you need to do, and always live true.